Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome to Sunday Bulwark on Sunday, our second episode. I'm the editor-at-large of the Bulwark. Eric Edelman is the co-host of the excellent Shield of the Republic weekly video and podcast, which everyone should watch to keep up to date on all things national security and foreign policy. Eric, a longtime foreign service official, twice ambassador, top policy job in the Defense Department. So great experience and very thoughtful about these matters. And there's plenty to talk about today, Eric, right?
It's a target-rich environment, as I might have said in my DoD days, Bill.
Yeah, I wish the targets weren't us.
Yeah,
I wish other countries were imploding, and anyway,
right.
That's what we need to talk about. So we're talking here, obviously, on Sunday, and the last 3-4 days have been dominated by the Trump phone call with Putin, the Hegseth speech in Brussels, the Vance speech in Munich at the Munich Security Conference, a conference you and I'm sure both, I've been several times, you've probably been many more times. But I thought we'd begin, maybe you noticed, you pointed out to me yesterday when we were chatting, the announcement of the forthcoming talks, I guess, between the U.S. and Russia, not Ukraine, in Saudi Arabia, I guess, about the U.S. and Russia going to negotiate a peace. And you read Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov's statement, since you actually read Russian, having been educated back in the Cold War days when you. So tell us. I was struck by what you said yesterday. So let's just begin with that, if that's okay.
So, I mean, it's now been translated into English, but I read the original Foreign Ministry readout of the Marco Rubio, Sergei Lavrov phone call, and what struck me about it, and it was a little bit different than the U.S. readout, but what struck me about it was the degree to which the Russian readout made it clear that the Trump administration was sort of throwing its predecessors under the bus by basically saying that, among other things that they're going to discuss, not just Ukraine, they're going to discuss the Middle East, they're going to discuss the situation in Palestine, as the foreign ministry said, and removal of the unilateral obstacles that had been created by the previous administration, the Biden administration, to full U.S.-Russian relations, full normal U.S.-Russian relations, including limits on embassies, sanctions, obviously other things. So this was, in some sense, an effort to completely normalize the U.S.-Russian relationship, prospectively undoing things that go back to, the end of the Obama administration and the Russian interference in 2016 presidential election and the limits on embassies that were imposed at that point in time. And the Russian statement also echoes the Russian readout of the Putin-Trump phone call, saying that the talks are going to focus on the, quote, root causes of the conflict in Ukraine, which is, Russian code for not the fact that we're going to deal, with the Russian, unprovoked, premeditated aggression against Ukraine. We're going to talk about NATO enlargement and an independent Ukraine, Western-oriented, living next door to Russia. So to me, it all had a very ominous ring to it.
It's amazing, I mean, these sanctions, and as you say, there were some that go back to 2014 and 2016, but the bulk, obviously, after February 24th, 2022, after the all-out invasion,
right?
Totally bipartisan support. It wasn't like, A, it's probably bad to give away all your negotiating leverage ahead of time. B, it's probably bad to just walk away from everything a previous administration has done, even if you happen not to agree with it. There's sort of a case for certain continuity in foreign policy, but they don't believe that, obviously. But these are things that everyone was for 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago. And everyone was for, incidentally, as late as 3 or 4 months ago, right? You didn't hear a lot of Republican members of Congress screaming and yelling about how we need to be buddying up to Putin. We need to give up on sanctions. If anything, the typical Republican critique was Biden had been a little lax, and even people in the Trump administration, we're going to take the sanctions up from a 3 to 6 and all this. And then it turns out, no. It turns out it's total. I mean, I guess that's what I was so struck by when you just now what you said and what you'd said yesterday. I mean, total accommodation to Putin's point of view, I guess.
Yeah. So look, the the sanctions that were passed, some of the sanctions that are so-called CATSA sanctions that were passed in the beginning of the Trump administration. Trump signed that, law essentially really kind of under protest. He did not want to sign it, but I believe, you'd have to check me on this, but I think it had 98 votes, which, to your point, it gives you a sense of how broad the support was, for all this. The other sort of anomaly I would say that has cropped up is that once upon a time Keith Kellogg was named the Ukraine envoy, and it was Keith Kellogg who was talking about dialing up sanctions from 3 to 10 or from 6 to 10, depending on which audience he was speaking to. But he's not going to be in Saudi Arabia for the discussions. Apparently, he's the envoy for Ukraine to talk to Ukrainians and Europeans, because he's been at Munich and he's been a meeting in Europe. But it's going to be Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, Marco Rubio, Steve Witkoff, who initially at least was the Middle East ambassador who was going to focus on the Abraham Accords, and did play a role in getting along with the Biden administration, getting the ceasefire in Gaza agreed before Trump came into office. There was some speculation he was going to lead the Iran, negotiations that Trump has talked about. But he now, pitched up in Moscow and was involved in the release of the teacher Fogel, who was held for having medical marijuana in his luggage unjustly for several years, and now is apparently going to be part of the Russian negotiating team. There's reporting that Trump, he's a longtime friend of Trump's, 40-year friend, real estate developer, and Trump believes he's like the best negotiator in the world. And so he's going to be doing the negotiations.
So, you put it all together, the Trump phone call with Putin, the Hegseth and Vance speeches. Our sense, I think, was a very big moment in terms of, sadly, maybe the fate of Ukraine, certainly in terms of the U.S. commitment to Ukraine, but not just Ukraine, right, to Europe. That Hegseth sentence that I remember we discussed it the afternoon after he gave that speech about Europe's no longer really the focus of our foreign policy, or whatever it was. I don't say a word about I want to get to the broader stuff, because I know you have real strong thoughts about that. But short term, how big a pivot is this? How big are these 3 or 4 days that historians will look back on and say this was the moment where it really became clear that we were in a new era?
Well, I think first of all, this is not. Some of this is not surprising, of course. Much of this has been telegraphed by Trump during his campaign for the presidency. I think what's becoming clear is there clearly was some debate going on inside the Trump administration about Russia's weakness. That was the economic weakness. Trump even talked about that before his phone call with Putin. There was talk about sanctions and maybe levying increased sanctions that Keith Kellogg talked about. But what's transpired over the last several days, all the things you mentioned, including the Vance speech at Munich, kind of indicates that whether or not there's going to be a formal withdrawal from NATO, that the U.S. commitment to defend Europe is increasingly going to be called into question by Europeans and potentially by Vladimir Putin and Russia. And therein lies the danger, I think, because it looks like they're hell-bent on, a very quick agreement on Ukraine. Keith Kellogg's talked about 100 days. There's a lot of speculation in the press that they might want to try and get something done by Russian Orthodox Easter, which is in late April, or maybe May 9th, which would be Victory Day. That would obviously be, Putin's preference. Tim Snyder, the historian of Ukraine at Yale University, has in a piece he wrote yesterday, said it's hard to tell because there's been so much confusion about exactly what their plan is, for negotiating with Putin, whether they're trying to sell out Ukraine by intent whether it's by incompetence or, as he put it, whether it's both intent and incompetence. I opt, by and large for the latter interpretation. I think there's both intent and incompetence going on. It was very striking to me in the Financial Times. There was a story about the questionnaire that the U.S. State Department sent to Europeans saying, okay, how many troops are you ready to, provide for some kind of, a sort of very ambiguous security guarantee for Ukraine? And they were talking to the Financial Times journalists were talking to some unidentified but former senior Russian officials who've been involved in some of these contacts with the U.S. And one of them said, well, Kellogg's not really a serious person. We're not really going to deal with Kellogg. And, and this is how Trump likes to do things. He sends a bunch of people out and then he gets to the real serious negotiations. But what he doesn't understand is that Vladimir Putin is a master of understanding human relationships at several levels above Trump. I mean, what they were really saying is this guy is a professional KGB case officer and he knows how to manage Trump. And you saw evidence of that in Trump's own readout, I think, of the phone calls or the phone call with he had multiple readouts of the phone call with Putin, both orally and on Truth Social, all of which reflect, the fact, I think, that Putin was very successfully manipulating him. I think we're headed towards a bad deal, and that will there'll be knock-on consequences of that, both for, obviously for Ukraine in the first instance, but for Europe more broadly, including our Nordic and Baltic allies, the most recent additions to NATO, Finland and Sweden, but also Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Poland, who are right the frontline states with Russia. They're very concerned and very nervous about this, and they ought to be.
Yeah, and since you mentioned Trump's own readout, I mean, one of the things that was striking, and we discussed this, was and you mentioned just now, alluded to it, Trump said in one of the readouts, we were allies for 80 years ago, and we should be able to recreate that or restore that or something. And it struck me that would be a classic thing that Putin would have said in the phone call. Well, where did Trump get that suddenly from? That's not, been sort of central to his thinking, I don't believe, in the past particularly. But, the 80, as you say, Victory Day, the celebration of the victory over Nazi Germany in the Soviet Union, I guess, is May 9th. Is that right? And that they have a big parade and all that talk about how they should visit each other's countries. Why do I suspect that Trump will enjoy being Putin's feted guest at this massive display of military hardware on May 9th in Moscow, right? And then he'll have brought peace, as he said he would. And I mean, we're heading to such a, as you say, we're heading to where Putin wants us to be heading, I fear.
Yeah, I mean, in the readouts, both, I'm trying to remember now because he had two different Truth Social posts and then, his comments in the Oval Office. But he mentioned the fact that Putin had reiterated to him that if we only dealt with this with common sense, which was Trump's campaign, slogan during the campaign, and Putin had previously said, and I suspect he repeated it in the phone call, played back to Trump's frequent comments that if I'd been president, there never would have been, an invasion in 2022. Which, of course, is belied by the fact that the fighting in the Donbass continued throughout Trump's first term. So it was not as if somehow the war in Ukraine had been called off while Trump was president.
Hey, YouTube fam, if you want to support The Bulwark, the best way to do it is by becoming a YouTube Bulwark Plus member. The Bulwark is truly independent. We have no corporate overlords. We're not settling any dumb lawsuits with Trump. By joining, you help support our work, and you can get a bunch of perks right here on this platform. Ad-free content, bonus videos, live streams, and some emojis of me, which I guess some people want. So come join, come hang out, become a Bulwark YouTube Plus member, and I'll be seeing you in the comments. So behave.
So let's talk about the implications of this. I mean, let's almost leave aside the direct implications for Ukraine, which are extremely worrisome to say the least. And obviously, as you say, neighbors of Russia and neighbors of Ukraine, and the whole question of NATO. But more broadly, you said I was very struck because you're not an alarmist, I would say, by nature, and you've seen an awful lot of challenges over your career. But you said this is going to make Americans less safe. To me, we were just chatting yesterday. So explain that a little bit. People think, well, people like you and me, we like the old order where things are changing, get with it. But it's not really going to affect us. It's just kind of stuff that it may affect some unfortunate foreigners, but we're not supposed to care about them anymore since it's all America first. But so talk about that.
I think everything that's going on actually is going to make Americans less safe at home and abroad. We can get into the home front later if you'd like. And it's also going to be a major challenge to Americans' prosperity as well. On the safety point, a couple of things. First, while Trump was trumpeting the release of Mark Fogel, the teacher who was unjustly being detained by the Russians, they traded him essentially for a cyber criminal. This fellow Munich, who had pled guilty to money laundering and other charges. And all that does, of course, is incentivize further hostage taking. And lo and behold, there's been another American who's actually been arrested. Same exact deal. Had a prescription for medical marijuana, had it in his suitcase, stopped at Vnukovo Airport in Moscow, detained. So now we got another hostage. And in this kind of negotiation only incentivizes more foreign government hostage taking of Americans, whether it's Russia or Iran or various others. Secondly, this is going to call into question the American security guarantee to our European allies, which has led to a long peace in Europe since 1945, and the absence of that U.S. guarantee could tempt Putin to do more. Maybe first in Moldova, where we don't have a U.S. security guarantee, but potentially in the Baltic states. One of the things I think that people who follow Russia closely know that the Russian military, despite all the terrible, suffering of its forces and the losses that they have suffered, which are immense, is reconstituting very quickly. And moreover, we just had, a statement by the head of MI6, the British intelligence service, about Russia's very, very dangerous campaign of sabotage in Europe and potentially against American interests in Europe, but also potentially here at home. So this is all going to be very bad for European security and endanger American security as a result, which our security has been tied to European security for well over 100 years, and it will continue to be. So that's, point one. Point two, the tariff war on Europe is going to, and the fact that we're cutting them loose essentially and saying, sauve qui peut, fend for yourselves, is going to make them much less willing to work with us to contain what the Trump administration has been saying is the big major threat to the United States, which is the People's Republic of China in the Indo-Pacific. Basically violating the diplomatic law of conservation of enemies. They're creating ructions that we don't need, including with our close allies and trading partners like Canada. I mean, I'm a big hockey fan, and you may have been struck, as I was, by the fact that last night at the U.S.-Canada hockey match in the four nations tournament that's going on right now, Finland, Sweden, the United States, and Canada, that number one, the U.S. national anthem was booed. Number two, I've never heard a more robust rendition of "O Canada." And there were three fights that broke out between the two teams, in the first 9 seconds of the game. I got to say, I've never not rooted for the U.S. in any international hockey event. And as a dyed-in-the-wool Caps fan, I hate Sidney Crosby with a passion, but I was rooting for the Canadians last night.
That's what it's come to. I mean, it is terrible, really. I feel the same way, though. But the U.S. government is part of the is much part of the problem
Right.
for international security, but also for liberal values as it's part of the solution now. That's what's so horrifying, right?
Yes.
It feels to me like,
that is precisely the problem. That Europeans are waking up to the fact that we have been the organizing principle around which they have arrayed their various security efforts, and they now have to contemplate a world in which we might not in fact unlikely to be there to help defend them, and they've got to figure out how to deal with that.
And we've been a huge beneficiary of their trust in us, in a sense, in terms of economics and our prosperity as well, I think, as well as security, more precisely, since we were dragged into two wars when Europe was unstable in the first half of the 20th century. But just the degree to which the Trump world, MAGA world, Doge world don't seem to understand that we've benefited a lot from this international order.
Absolutely.
Trust and confidence in the U.S.
Both economically and in terms of security, and both now I think are at risk. I mean, a lot of people were comparing J.D. Vance, Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Summit, which some wag on Twitter or X described as actually a long Twitter thread rather than a speech. And having read the text of the speech now, I can attest to the fact that is a perfectly correct reading of it. But people have been comparing it, in terms of the shock value that it induced in Munich, to Vladimir Putin's speech in 2007 to the Munich Security Conference. What does that tell you? I mean, it really goes to your point that we're not the solution, we're the problem now. I mean, Vance, when he spoke, started with some appropriate, grace notes about the horrible episode in Munich, which occurred the day before the conference began, of an Afghan refugee driving into a crowd of people, killing a number, and apparently Islamist motivation for it. Appropriately conveyed condolences, etc., got applause for it. And then he said, I hope that's not the last applause I get in the speech. But it really was, because the speech, instead of saying in the conferences about threats to international and particularly European security, instead of dealing with any of the threats to European security or Ukraine, which people anticipated he would talk about, it became a sort of MAGA red meat, anti-cancel culture diatribe against the European Union, the European order, and suggesting that the biggest threat to Europe was not Russia or China, but the threat from within, and essentially called for the Europeans politically to make their peace with these sort of populist nationalist parties that have cropped up all across Europe that share a kind of agenda with MAGA, despite the fact that many of them, like the AfD in Germany, are either Nazi, neo-Nazi or Nazi adjacent, and therefore bring up all sorts of terrible memories for Europeans who are trying to keep that kind of politics from reasserting itself in Europe. I mean, it was truly astonishing as a moment. And of course, he met with the AfD leader while he was in Munich. He refused, while he was in Germany, to meet with the current chancellor, Gustav Scholz, although he did meet with Scholz, in his defense in Paris at the AI summit in the days leading up to the Munich Security Conference. But still, kind of, I think, it left a terrible taste in European mouths, but also the German hosts. I mean, Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, social democrat, most popular minister in the government, very pro-Ukraine, went out immediately and gave his own speech, decrying what Vance had done and declaring that kind of interference in European politics really is unacceptable. But just a very disheartening performance all the way around. I'm told by people who were there at Munich that not only could they not find anybody in Europe who would even begin to defend this thing, or at the conference who would begin to defend it. I'm sure there are people like Eric Zemmour in France and others who would defend it, but that there was literally Vance kept stopping for applause lines after the initial applause, and there was none forthcoming.
I mean, it is just the idea that the vice president of the United States is going to Munich and defending the AfD and chastising really the Germans for excluding this neo-Nazi or anti-Nazi, maybe let's say minimally anti-Nazi party from government, and the Europeans generally have been tried to exclude these kinds of parties from governance. There's no free speech. Incidentally, that's not even a free speech issue. There are some differences in the way we handle hate speech than the Europeans. We're more First Amendment oriented. And I guess it's fair enough. I mean, on the other hand, it's kind of a weird thing to raise as the main centerpiece of your speech at a security conference. And again, I thought these guys were sort of in favor of us running our own country and them running their own countries, but whatever. But the idea that you're actually chastising them for being too anti-Nazi, basically, in Munich, I mean, for a U.S. vice president, it is astonishing. One thing you mentioned in passing, I just want to pick up here as we approach here. We'll let people go soon on the Sunday, but you mentioned just in passing that, of course, this undercuts the hawkish rhetoric against China. And I think it's worth, people don't quite think about that. I mean, how do we have a serious plan to somewhat isolate China to make sure we're not dependent on China and so forth without the cooperation of the Europeans? I mean, it's not doable, right? I mean, the whole idea of a serious anti-China policy, you've written about this, our friend Aaron Friedberg has written about this, others, would be to have a kind of consortium of the democracies, the strong, the powerful industrial democracies, ranging from the European allies to Japan and India and so forth, which kind of we leave China on its own and therefore weaken China in some ways. But that's not possible if Europe has been told fend for yourself. And God knows they'll be, to say nothing of cutting deals with Russia directly, but also with China, right? I remember when I was in Germany a couple of years ago, there's a lot of talk about that. Germany had done a pretty good job of cutting its ties with Russia, and people didn't quite expect they would, as much as they did in terms of energy. But China was the tougher one.
Yeah.
But there was some movement there, I'd say, when when it was clear that it was a U.S. priority and that would be sort of being part of the alliance would be to have a tougher stance to China. But once you discredit the alliance, what incentives do they have? I mean,
yeah, no. One of the whole thrusts of U.S. policy, for the last 8 years has been to try and get the Europeans more on board with our concerns about China. And European concerns have been growing. I mean, there was a lot of concern about Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy during the pandemic, for instance, in Europe. Mm-hmm. A lot of exposure of Chinese influence efforts in Europe and in the European Parliament. NATO has, taken on, the fact that China is a strategic challenge for, the North Atlantic Alliance, not just the United States. But everything that we've just been talking about undercuts that. And I was really struck, actually, by one particular piece of Vance's indictment of the Europeans, which was having to do with the Russian influence operation in Romania over the Romanian election, which basically took place using TikTok, as best we can tell. Now, look, one can have different views about how well the Romanians handled this issue in terms of the impact it had on their presidential election. But we're the country, last I looked, that led by Republicans outlawed TikTok in the United States. And now he's basically saying, you Europeans are so afraid of TikTok in Romania. What's wrong with you? Why are you, you're allowing this fight against disinformation to enable cancel culture? It's astonishing, honestly.
Yeah, the attack, I don't know that much about Romania, but I was talking with someone who's from there. I mean, the Supreme Court can't annul the first election because
Right.
they thought illegitimate Russian interference just went beyond just, as Vance sort of characterized it, paying for some internet ads,
Right. Right.
But Romania is a small country right near Russia. It's not, maybe when they interfere here, they can't have quite as much success. They had some in 2016. But in Romania, it's a different story. But you know what they did? They scheduled another election.
Right.
I mean, it's not like they've stopped democracy in Romania, unlike incident. And so far as one can tell, a fair election with both different people. The candidate who has benefited from Russia, I believe, is running again. It's not as if they banned him or something. It's not like so the country that he chooses to criticize is not Hungary. It's not other countries that are tilting in a Putin-esque direction. And it's not Russia,
Right.
It's Romania, this small country that's trying to preserve what is a somewhat weak democracy, which Vance sort of ridicules. Well, if you're scared of them, I guess you just have a very weak democracy. Well, yes, you know what? Our job. I'm old enough to remember, and you were part of this. You were stationed in the Czech Republic, and
Yeah.
as I recall, our job is to help strengthen weak democracies, not to mock them.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, uh, it's of a piece with what we see them doing here at home with the attack on USAID, on the National Endowment for Democracy, all of those efforts, as you were just saying, that we have embraced to strengthen democracy as countries emerged from under essentially Soviet domination in the Cold War. And this is just a complete reversal of all that, and a transvaluation of values, if you would.
Well, it's been a big moment. I hope it's maybe there'll be reaction against this moment in the U.S. and in the Congress of the U.S. and maybe among both parties in the Congress of the U.S. But I
One would
guess we'll
hope.
have to see, and one would hope. We can discuss that when we next meet. Eric, thank you. It's really terrific to draw on your wisdom and experience here, and very illuminating for me, and I'm sure for everyone else watching here on the Bulwark on Sunday. Thank you for joining us.